I'm only going to speak for about 15 minutes because I wanted as much time as possible for Q&A because I sense that there hasn't been much so far, and also because I'm always very excited about hearing other people's views and questions. But let me start by making a few remarks. The first, by the way, is that I'll talk a little about my recent book. It's always rather difficult to understand another country, let alone another continent or another culture. There are things you have in common, there are things which seem bizarre when you look at them from outside, and there are things that look recognizable, there are things that rhyme. There are an enormous number of similarities between where I'm from and where most of you are from, and an enormous number of differences too. I've been in the States all week, spoken at a campus, and was on the West Coast at the beginning of the week, and I had one of those disassociation moments in San Francisco when I had been in my, I think, second day in the city, and I just noticed that absolutely everywhere there seemed to be posters advertising deliveries services for marijuana. And I thought, this is interesting, because if there's one thing, it seems to me, that San Francisco doesn't need, it's easier access to marijuana. More of it, just so that people who smoke it don't even have to go down the street. But there are lots of similarities between our societies as well, and one of the, I suppose, most gratifying things since The Strange Death of Europe came out in June here in the US is a number of people who have come over to me and written to me from America, from Canada, from Australia, and said, this book is about us, isn't it? And perhaps I could start by just saying a little about what it is about, and you'll get some of the resonances. The Strange Death of Europe centers on the 2015 migration crisis, which you'll all remember was the moment when Angela Merkel massively exacerbated an already existing problem by announcing unilaterally that the external and internal borders of Europe were basically dissolved. In a single act, the mass movement of people that had been going on for decades sped up exponentially, so that Germany in a single year took in an additional 2% of its population, that Sweden took in an additional almost 3% of its population. This is all part of a pattern, I say, that has been going on for many decades, and just like those previous decades, what happened after the 2015 crisis was that politicians and the media found excuses to justify something that would have happened anyway. So, for instance, German citizens and others were told that this mass migration, millions of people into Europe, would be a net economic gain for their society, that it would enrich their society. Now, actually, all of the studies that I've gone over in this show that at best most such migration cannot be called to be any kind of economic gain. A study in Britain showed that over a 15-year period, migrants took out 95 billion more in services than they put in taxation. And of course they would. If you go to another country, you don't speak the language, you don't have the skills, it's going to be a very long time before you've put in anything into the welfare system remotely like the amount that you and your family will have taken out. But this is one of the arguments that are made. And by the way, just as in all of the decades after the war, so in the post-2015 moment, the governments that came up with these explanations had to hedge around the facts, so that just like the Labour government after 1997, they had to pretend that the average migrant was a Luxembourgian hedge funder. And this is just one of the lies that gets told to the people. Because once that one is shot down, once, for instance, you notice that the number of people who've been added to Germany's welfare bill in the last year is almost exactly the number of the people who came in 2015. Once you go over that lie, you get to another one, which the German people and others were told, which is that we are an aging population, we are a greying population, and that therefore we need obviously to bring people in to keep us and our society into the standards to which we've become accustomed. Of course, this argument always ignores one extraordinary thing which none of the politicians ever seem to be able to recognize, which is the startling fact that migrants get old as well. It's amazingly enough, it's not just us Europeans who suffer the aging process. Who knew? But of course, if you do believe in that idea, that you need to keep on bringing people to keep yourself in the custom that you're now used to, you get what I describe as the pyramid problem in migration. You keep having to bring in more and more people all the time to keep yourselves in that sustainable societal moment. But so if once you get the one of, well, okay, maybe they don't make us richer, maybe the aging population thing doesn't work, you get to another one, which is diversity. It doesn't matter if we're financially poorer. It doesn't matter because we're so much more culturally rich. Now, I should say that there is something in this. What society, Europeans certainly wouldn't do, is what society doesn't want to know as much of interest and culture as the world has to offer. Who doesn't want to know as much about the world and about the ideas of the world as possible? But, of course, the first person from, for instance, India to bring Indian cuisine into the UK does an interesting service, vims up the local cuisine. It's not the case that the next 100 Indians who come in, for instance, bring 100 times more interesting cuisine. It's not the case that the first Sudanese poet who enters the UK massively brings interest to your country, and that the next 1,000 people from Sudan continue to just bring ever richer versions of the poetry of Sudan. And by the way, please don't ask me to name my favorite Sudanese poet. But this is just a part of that lie. They also say, you also notice, by the way, that this is always a one-way street. Not once in my adult life have I heard anybody say that the thing that Eritrea needs most is an injection of Welshmen. that they just could do with some Welsh cooking. Or singing. Nobody says this. Nobody says, as Mark Stein and I were saying in the conversation recently, nobody says, the thing that the Somalis really need is a bit more Bach. I actually think it'd be nice for them if they had a bit more Bach, but nobody thinks that's an appropriate way to say it. But Europeans are told there's something hollow at our heart, as if we in Europe, the culture of Dante and Goethe and Bach, has some kind of diminishment, something hollow at its center that needs filling by the world. And then you get to another stage in this, which is, okay, maybe it doesn't make you richer. Maybe the aging population thing does fall apart. Maybe the diversity thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. Or, as I put it at one point in my book, maybe we have to just do an agreement that this is a quid pro quo. We have a bit more gang rape and beheading than we used to have, but then there's a wider range of cuisines, so who's to... Life's all swings and roundabouts, so... But then you get to the last stage of that, which is the one that politicians now say and speak to us about, which is, okay, maybe none of these things are the case. Well, suck it up. This is globalization. This is going to happen anyway. This is a hell of a way to speak to the general public about their and their children's future. And it is only said, once again, to the peoples of Europe in this tone. So, I explain at great length not just the stats and the results of my travels across not just all of Europe, but many of the countries that the migrants have been coming from, trying to explain in as much detail and with much honesty as possible the reality of the situation that my continent now faces, but also to explain the deeper underlying reasons why this might be happening. Because it seems to me that what I describe as the strange death of Europe, I say in the opening line, Europe is committing suicide, or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. Whether the publics agree to go along with that or not is another matter. Now, this strange death, this suicide, seems to me to be a very unnatural thing to happen in nature. And so there must be, and I posit that there are, deeper underlying reasons for it. One is what I described, taking it from the French philosopher Pascal Bruckner, to be the tyranny of guilt, this overwhelming guilt, that, specifically the German guilt that has spread across the continent in the decades since the war. You, of course, in America have a very clear version of this yourself. Just as we in Europe now have this myth of original sin, so you now have it in America. The original sin of slavery, the original sin of racism, and the European versions of the original sin of colonialism, and so on. Again, it's a one-way movement. And of course we fall for it, as everybody who has children, grandchildren, or has attended an American campus in recent years knows. If you say to a student, and I do it quite often, what is your solution for instance, the problems that Nigeria currently faces? They have no solutions, they have no suggestions, very few of them can point to the country on a map. But the one thing they all can be sure about is that at some point it must have been their or their ancestors' fault. The fastest fast track to look like you're a knowledgeable young person is to blame yourself and your own society. And, as I say at another point in the book, this is the problem that I'm told we get to, the big problem I'm told, I stress, that masochists always risk, which is what happens to them when they meet a real sadist. And Europe is meeting a real sadist. So you think you're appalling, empty, barren, rubbish, guilty. We agree. This seems to me to be the worst possible concatenation of events. The mass movement of peoples into a society, then at the point that that society appears to have lost its own faith in itself. This, two of the other big underlying issues I raise in the book, are what I call firstly the sense of European tiredness, as a German word I use that translates roughly as tiredness with history, or weariness with history. We've gone through so many of the wars of religion, the wars of nation states, the wars of ideas, the political dreams, that you're just tired of it all. And that, at that point, a change might be as good as a rest. And then there's a sense of what I describe as a sense that the story may have run out, and that this is just our fate to go through. Now, I'm very weary and wary, rather, about making predictions. I do at the end of the book say roughly two directions I think this could go, but specific predictions I tend to avoid. After all, we live in a world where Harvey Weinstein can end up causing the resignation of the British Defence Minister, so who knows what the rules of causality are in this world we now live in. But there are some predictions that you can make. One is that it's fairly obvious that Europe will not be the same place with different people in it, and that it isn't the case that people who just walk into a continent immediately absorb all the ideas of that continent. And I say in the subtitle of my book is Immigration, Identity and Islam, that the Islam bit matters because it's clearly proving for Europe to be the part that we may not be able to digest, or are finding it at the very least very hard to digest. And, you know, there are all sorts of motifs that go around on this. One is the constant claim that there might at some point be a tipping point. I've given up claiming that there is such a thing as a tipping point. If we'd have met this time last year and you'd said to me there'll be 3 major terrorist attacks in your country in the opening months of the year, I'd have probably said, well, that might be the tipping point. But it turns out that 22 young women killed on a Monday night at a pop concert in Manchester, within ours, the motif becomes, how can we have love rather than hate? How can we overcome hate? Hatey, hatey, hate. Sing John Lennon's Imagine. Imagine there's no borders. Great idea. Or then we had one of the Gallagher brothers' songs, a song called Don't Look Back in Anger. People started crooning away, don't look back in anger. Why not? Why not? You know, we had a Love, Love, Stop the Hate concert, I think 2 weekends after the Manchester Arena bombing. And there was a bit of, that was sad. And then they got onto all the dancing and boogieing. They didn't pay any attention, the media didn't pay attention to the fact that the dead hadn't even been buried. There were still girls in the hospitals having bits of bolts and nails taken out of their spines. Well, at least we've moved on, it didn't get us down. Boogie on. I deeply resent this tone, and I suspect and know that a great number of the members of the public in Europe deeply dislike it too. The reception of this book, by the way, has been rather startling. The Guardian and the New York Times both tried to snuff this out at birth and didn't succeed. It's now I think the best-selling non-fiction book of the year in the UK. It's been the top. I'm not after applause for it, but yes, the publishers said that actually their quarterly reports were far higher than they expected because of me and Harry Potter, which was not a combination I'd ever thought would come about, but my mother had told me for a long time that it would be worth getting into books about wizards, because it was good for sales. So I was pleased to say I got there without the wizards. And the best thing really has been the number of publishers that have been sidling up to me since, saying things like, I told my bosses we should do something in this area. One publisher in the UK said to me that their boss, after my book had been at the top of the bestseller lists for 20 weeks, said that their boss said to them, well, we don't want those readers. Love his shareholders to know that. But anyway, we have for the time being continued this period of keep calm and carry onism, of ignoring the facts, but at some point they will inevitably catch up with us, and that's what the latter part of my book is about. There are people, of course, who don't care at all about this. I spoke to somebody the other week who said, well, it doesn't matter to me because I won't be here. It, among other things, that point of view breaks down what I regard as the central pact of civilization, which is that it's not just about you. That, as Edmund Burke most famously and brilliantly said, that civilization is a pact between the dead and the living and those yet to be born. And you have to hold that pact together, every bit of it. And to give it up and to break a part of that pact is to break everything that you should be loving and cherishing. Now, there are plenty of people today who are attacking us in Europe with genuine hate, just as there are here in America. But the one thing that they never take account of is that we are not just motivated in response by hatred and justified hatred at times, but also by love. Love of everything that we hold dear. Love of entire culture. Love of country. Love of family. Love of neighborhood. And love of everything that's gone before us. And that it would be the worst thing imaginable if, in response to having inherited that, we then handed on to the next generation something that was unrecognizable. So we have this gift in our power not to pass on something like a large version of Mogadishu to the next generation. It's in the balance there in Britain as it is here. But in the years ahead, we're all going to be walking through this same swamp. I'd like to hand over to you for questions. Thank you. I don't know whether there's a microphone or whether people with large lungs can just holler.
Yes, hello, Mr. Murray. Thank you very much for a great speech. I have one question, sir. What do you believe is your prognosis for Eastern Europe? You know, Orthodoxy and the former Soviet republics, Warsaw Pact, they're not as willing to embrace this multiculturalism and this disease that affects Western Europe. What do you think is the prognosis for them?
Very good and very important question. I have a section in my book called Why Eastern Europeans Are Different. You're right. I was in Hungary again a couple of weeks ago. The Polish translation of my book just came out. So, I mean, speaking there, they have a different, totally different view on this. I think there are lots of reasons. But the central one, I suggest, is that Eastern Europeans have retained what a great Spanish philosopher described as the tragic sense of life. The thing that we in Western Europe, and I think large numbers of people in America have forgotten, which is, as I say, the tragic sense of life. Life as we have it now is highly unusual, historically speaking. We're extraordinarily lucky with what we have, and we think that this luck goes on forever. The Eastern Europeans remember that differently. They get swept aside from one side, and just as they get rid of that, they get swept aside from another. They got no time off from history. And they remember this. They remember that even the things you care about most can be destroyed utterly by people who are utterly unworthy of them. And I think we've forgotten that in the West. But they have good reason to keep that memory. And as a result, I think that their future will be very different. Somebody else. Gentleman there.
Yes, thank you so much for being here today. Here in the United States, there's also another line that we face, which is, as we discuss these issues of immigration, particularly with respect to Muslim immigration, we are told we are a nation of immigrants, and particularly in certain aspects, for example, in the Jewish community, if it were not for the United States, we would not be here, my family would not be here. How do you go and address that particular core issue? We are a country with a history of welcoming others. We are welcoming the different people. I, of course, respond, why welcome people that don't share your values?
Sure.
What say you?
It's a very important question. There are several things. There are two critiques of this book which I found interesting, but this one is the one of the most interesting. Yes, America is a nation of immigrants. It's true. Of course, it's not true with Britain. And it's not true with most of Europe, actually. We've had very, very static populations. So that, to give you a quick example, everyone talks about the Huguenots, the French Protestants who came over in the 17th century. 50,000 French Huguenots, French Protestants, came over after 1681, sorry. And that, by the 1990s, was an average of 6 weeks of migration into the UK. So we still talk about the Huguenots, which was a one-off, when that's going on all the time now. And of course, the French Huguenots, French Protestants, had a better chance of integrating into Britain than, say, a Nigerian Muslim is going to. And I think this is a question, this is not a science, but there are obvious truths that we have to be able to face up to, which is that some groups integrate better than others, and we have to work out what the general rules are. Now, where I'm from, as I say, that this is a deeper problem than it is here. Your sense that you have an integration success story, you still have the sense that it's a good thing to be in America and that you're lucky to be in America, and a lot of things like that. The response in Europe is very, very different on that. And, I would say that one of the things you can agree is, let's at least look at what the basic ground rules are. Okay? If I moved to this country, for instance, and became a citizen, I might say, I want to bring certain of my values. Imagine if I said to you, I would like to bring my car. Okay. You might think that's a rather odd thing to do, but okay. And my wheel would be on the other side from yours. You say, okay, it's a sort of quirk. This British guy likes driving on that side of it. But if I said, and I also want to continue to have the right to drive down the left-hand side, we'd have to talk about that, wouldn't we? And that's what a lot of this is about. There are lots of groups here who feel very sensitive, by the way, when I talk about immigration in American context, because there are so many people here who think, like a lot of Jews do in Europe, oh my gosh, what if this is about us? But it's not about you. It's about the people who don't want to join the you. And that's a big challenge we're all going to have. Can I have time for one more question?
We have time for one more, and then I'll ask
question.
everyone to stay in their seats because Milo will be coming up as soon as Douglas leaves the podium. So Jerry gets the last question.
It's kind of been easy to get into the minds of the ruling elites as far as this collective guilt. But how do you account for the phenomenon, I think was it in Nottingham, where you have blue-collar police who are actively suppressing the ongoing rapes of British girls by Muslims? How do you account for that? Is equivalent to the concentration camp guards, or how do you put it together?
Well, because they are trying to ring-fence and defend what they believe, rightly or wrongly, to be the religion of our time. I mean, like all belief systems, it shatters in a very ugly fashion. But we've been trying to sustain a whole set of unsustainable ideas. And one of them is this idea, as I say, that people don't bring their own ideas when they move into a culture. They're all the same. The moment you walk over the border, you immediately get 21st century ideas about women and everything else. So these policemen who are in this position of, they're having to police that. They're not just policing criminality or crimes. They're trying to police the culture. They're trying to hold together the whole thing. And I've spoken to many people who have gone through this cognitive dissonance. It's the same reason why in Britain at the moment, if your house gets burgled, if you get robbed in the street, it's very likely the police will tell you they don't have time to look into the crime. Whereas if, as some people present know, you send out a tweet with the wrong tone of joke in it, they'll be all over you. So as I say, this is just one part of that phenomenon. Now, I'm aware that I've got Mike Finch standing to my left, which usually is of great pleasure always, but it also almost certainly signals a change in speaker. But can I just say, I've got to sadly go up to New York after this, but and it's such a pleasure always to be here at Restoration. It's an enormous pleasure to meet so many friends and to see so many heroes, one of whom is walking down the aisle as we speak. But thank you for your time, and I hope to see you another year. Thank you.